the fire in the Balkans has been mirrored by a fire in the Caucasus. The difference is Britain and America encouraged the one in the Balkans and are proving incapable of extinguishing the one in the Caucasus. I refer to South Ossetia and now Abkhazia, both of which are now in flames. Now, military historian and security expert Mike Yardley has been on the show before and greatly impressed all concerned. So I've asked him to join us tonight, late on a Saturday evening, and I'm grateful to him for agreeing, to talk about the security situation, the military situation in the Caucasus, in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and I'm glad to say he's with us now. Mike, thanks very much for joining us.
Good evening, George.
It's a difficult situation now. Mike, I was saying in my talk up to this that the new noises just in the last hour or so coming out of George W. Bush, that he's blaming the Georgians equally with the Russians now, even though the day before it was purely the Russians to blame. This is probably because the limits of the US's power to influence events is about to be starkly shown up. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I think I do, George. I think that the other thing to be said is thank God Georgia isn't a member of NATO at the moment, because where might that have led?
Exactly.
That is a truly terrifying prospect, and the Georgians, of course, with the backing of the US, had been hoping to become members of NATO. The French and the German governments opposed that idea, and I think clearly it is a very dangerous idea. And in fact, I was only saying a couple of weeks ago to someone that I thought the situation generally globally at the moment bore some resemblance to the sort of situation of June 1914. So I very much hope I'm wrong.
Well, my clever comrade Kevin, an Oxford Blue, was just making that point an hour ago, Mike, that a far-off place of which we know little, and on the face of it, obscure events in very, very far from our shores. If Georgia had been a member of NATO, we would have been in what could be a First World War type express train heading for war.
Indeed we could, and of course the thing that set it all off then was the Serbian Black Hand and the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand. We all remember it, and it just set off a train of events which couldn't really be stopped. What is concerning, I mean, you mentioned the US's ability to project their power, and of course the blunt truth is there's not that much they can do about it other than on a diplomatic level. They've stretched themselves with Iraq. They have a massive military machine, no doubt, and of course there's been much talk about another conflict possibly with Iran, or possibly the Israelis acting as proxies. Well, you might ask which is tail and which is dog, but anyway, that there could have been something happening in Iran as well as in Iraq, and of course we have this other useless war going on in Afghanistan. It is a very scary situation. I do think that there is wrong and right on both sides, but I have to say, although I have not been a great fan of the Soviet army, the Red Army as was, or indeed the Russian Federation army as is, that you can understand that the Russians have got a thing about their terror, their border integrity, if you like, that the stuff that's going on the edges of their federation.
Well, can you imagine, Mike, if the Soviet Union, as was, had been actively involved in trying to get Canada into the Warsaw Pact? Do you think that the United States might have sponsored a breakaway or two in some provinces in Canada? I mean, it's this double standard again, isn't it? Our old friend, the double standard. I was making the point earlier, Mike, that when Kosovo wanted to break away, Britain and America backed it. And now that South Ossetia wants to break away from Georgia, Britain and America don't back it.
Yes, indeed, and it has been suggested, of course, that part of the reason for the problem is the Kosovan example, the Kosovan independence. What is clear is that we think that we're modern, but you look at this and the tanks are rumbling in, as they did 50 plus years ago.
It's very old style, isn't it?
It's very old style stuff, and it shows you really how primitive we still are in many ways. I think it's...
But that's because, and you know this better than me, Mike, and better than most people, war as a computer game, or as discussed by sandpit generals in the Newsnight studio, is one thing, but when you have to put boots on the ground, well, they have to be real leather and rubber boots, and they have to have real armour, and real hardware trundling along beside them, and in the end, war hasn't changed all that much.
I think that is the interesting thing, that for all the technology, for all the talk of super weapons and all the rest of it, whether you're talking about the situation in the Middle East, where indeed we have seen some pretty spectacular technology deployed, but where we've still got the tanks and we've still got the boots on the ground. But this is very old-fashioned stuff, isn't it? Very old-fashioned stuff. And people volunteering from the Russian side and apparently being given uniforms and then going to collection points and being given weapons and bussed in. It's a very old-looking deal, but it's nevertheless a very dangerous one. Ultimately, of course, at a military level, it's a no contest because, for example, I think the Georgians have something like 7 combat aircraft to the vast number that the Russian Federation has. I mean, the Russian Federation army is smaller than it was, but it's still probably...
Still 1 million or so, no?
In all, if their army strength's probably about half that, their serious army strength, but they do have a lot, there's a lot of other military personnel, whereas the Georgian army is something like 10,000 regulars, and they have some paramilitaries and others as well, which probably would double that number. But I mean, it's a no contest militarily. I mean, that's without question. Of course, unless you go to the guerrilla model or others, in which case the Russians might be taking on quite a lot. But having said that, we've heard of the dispatch of Russian Federation paratroops. I mean, pretty serious shock troops. I don't think there's any question that the Russian Federation would ultimately be victorious in this situation. Of course, the other interesting aspect politically, and of course you'll be the guy who'll be far more expert on this than I am, but we've seen these ongoing negotiations between the West and Georgia and other states down there, essentially because we're also desperate for fuel supplies. And the states in the Caucasus have been playing up to the West, if you like, as well, because they see mutual benefits there as well for themselves. It's creating a very unstable and dangerous situation, and the thing that concerns me, if we now take a couple of steps back and look at the broad global situation, is when I was a soldier in Germany, I was patrolling the border between West Germany and East Germany. And in a conventional war, we had a very short life expectancy. In a nuclear war, I think we had a life expectancy that was something of the order of 10 minutes. Now, what it seems to me has happened is that we have gone back now to what used to be called a sort of tripwire situation. We haven't got the massive conventional forces that we had. I mean, if you take the example of the UK, we used to have an army, 250,000, couple of 100,000 strong, not very long ago. Now our army's under 100,000.
And stretched across several theatres.
Absolutely, and stretched across several theatres. So we don't really have the response options, the conventional response options that we used to have. Basically, it's a situation, if any really big conflict occurred, we'd be back to pushing a button, because we can't do anything else. And that is pretty scary stuff.
Pretty scary indeed.